A brutal ice storm, a trail of blood across a Toronto driveway, and a stranger collapsed against her garage door. She had two choices: call 911 or drag him inside. By choosing the latter, she didn't just save a life, she lit the fuse on a war. The freezing rain had been falling since noon, coating every branch and power line in the beach's neighborhood, with a half-inch of ice that cracked like gunfire whenever the wind moved through the trees. By 9 that night, Toronto Hydro had already logged 40,000 outages east of the Don Valley, and the city had gone quiet in that specific way it only does during an ice storm. Streets empty, street lights flickering through sleet, everyone hunkered down behind frosted windows. For 26-year-old Eleanor Whitcomb, a third-year medical resident, finishing a 30-hour rotation at Toronto General, the storm was just one more obstacle between her and her bed. Her old Subaru Outback fishtailed twice on Queen Street before she finally coaxed it into the laneway behind her narrow Victorian Semi, engine ticking as it cooled in the freezing air. She almost didn't see him. It was the smear of red against the white crust of her side steps that stopped her. Too bright, too wrong against all that ice. She dropped her bag and went down on her knees beside him, without thinking, the cold soaking instantly through her scrub pants. He was face down, one arm bent beneath him, dark hair plastered with melting sleet, and for one terrible second she thought he was already gone. Then her fingers found his carotid and a pulse jumped weakly under her hand. "Hey, hey, can you hear me?" Her voice came out sharper than she meant it to. The ER-trained command voice she didn't even know she had until moments like this. He was wearing what had once been an extraordinary coat, black wool, hand-finished buttons, now shredded along one side and soaked through with blood that had nothing to do with the storm. Underneath, a dress shirt clung to him, dark and wet across the ribs. His hand shot up and closed around her wrist before she'd even processed that he was conscious. The grip was shocking. Controlled, deliberate, not the panicked grasp of a dying man, but the grip of someone assessing a threat, even half frozen on the ground. His eyes opened, and even in the dark she could see they were an unusual pale green, sharp with a clarity his body had no business having. No hospitals. His voice was a low rasp, the words clipped with something that wasn't quite a Canadian accent. Something older, European, sanded down by years somewhere else. "You're bleeding out. I'm a doctor, I need to." "No hospitals." His other hand moved, slow and deliberate, and the metallic weight of a handgun shifted against his coat. He didn't point it at her. He didn't have to. The message landed anyway, cold and absolute, cutting straight through the part of her brain still trying to be reasonable. "No police." "Okay," she heard herself say, and hated how steady it sounded. "Okay." No hospital. His eyes rolled back, and his grip went slack, and Eleanor was left kneeling in the freezing rain beside an unconscious, armed stranger, every piece of training and instinct screaming at her to go inside, lock the door, and pretend she'd seen nothing. Instead, she got her arms under his shoulders and started to drag. He was easily 200 pounds of dead weight, and her side steps were sheeted in ice, and twice she nearly went down with him on top of her. But somehow she got him through the side door and into her kitchen, slamming the deadbolt home behind them with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. She hauled him onto the kitchen floor. The hardwood in the living room wasn't worth ruining, and tore open the emergency kit she kept from her residency, the one stuffed with gauze and quick clot and a suture kit she'd never expected to use outside a trauma bay. She cut his shirt away with kitchen shears, and that was when she saw the tattoo. A black hawk with wings spread wide across his collarbone, talons closing around a coiled snake, ink so precise it had clearly cost someone a great deal of money and patience. She'd seen enough gunshot victims roll through Toronto General's doors to recognize gang ink when it stared up at her from a stranger's skin. But this wasn't street ink, this was something else. Something with money behind it. "Okay," she muttered to herself, snapping on gloves with hands gone steady now that her body had finally caught up to her training. "Whoever you are, you'd better not kill me for this." The wound was a through and through on his left side, low enough to have missed anything immediately fatal, but close enough to a major vessel that he'd already lost a dangerous amount of blood. She packed it with quick clot, pressed until her shoulders screamed, wrapped it tight enough to slow the bleeding without cutting off circulation entirely. He groaned once, deep and involuntary, but didn't wake. Hypothermia was the other problem. His skin had gone past cold into something closer to marble, and she stripped his ruined coat and shirt off entirely, piled every blanket in the house on top of him, and dragged her space heater out of the hall closet to aim directly at his chest. By the time she sat back on her heels, the kitchen floor was a crime scene of bloody gauze wrappers, and her hands were shaking again, this time from adrenaline crashing rather than fear. It was 2:40 in the morning. The ice storm outside hadn't let up. If anything, it had gotten worse, sleet hammering the kitchen window in long gusts that made the old house groan. She didn't sleep. She sat at her own kitchen table with her knees pulled to her chest, watching him breathe, watching the rise and fall of bandages soaked through and re-soaked, a mug of tea going cold beside her untouched. Every creak of the house made her flinch toward the door. She'd moved his gun to the far counter. Not that she had the faintest idea how to use it, but having it within reach of an unconscious man in her kitchen had felt like an unacceptable risk. Around 4:30, his fever broke into something worse, a delirious thrashing that had him muttering in 2 languages, his accent thickening, the careful control gone. She knelt beside him with a cool cloth, trying to keep him from tearing his bandages loose, and he caught her wrist again, harder this time, his eyes glassy and unseeing. "Where is he?" he demanded, chest heaving. "Where is Costa? I don't know who that is," she said, keeping her voice level, the same flat calm she used on combative patients in triage. "You're safe. You're in Toronto. You were shot. Let go of my arm." Something in her tone seemed to reach him even through the fever, and his hand loosened, dropped. He went under again, breathing shallow but steadier than before. Eleanor sat back, heart hammering, and let herself do the thing she'd been resisting for an hour. She went through his coat. She told herself it was for medical reasons. Blood type, allergies, anything that might keep him alive if his condition worsened. What she found instead was a roll of $100 bills thick enough to choke on, a black titanium card with no name embossed on it, a satellite phone heavier than any cell phone had a right to be, and finally a leather wallet with a driver's license that didn't match the face in front of her. Daniel Voss, it said, but the bone structure, the sharp angle of the jaw was unmistakably the man bleeding on her kitchen floor. A good fake, an expensive one. She'd seen the hawk and snake tattoo before, she realized. Not in person, but in a news photo from a piece about organized crime along the Great Lakes shipping corridor. A piece her father, a retired Hamilton cop, had once shown her over dinner with a kind of grim fascination. The Castellano Network, a name that controlled freight coming through 3 different ports and answered to almost no one. She was sheltering the most dangerous man currently breathing in this city, and she had absolutely no way to undo it now. By 6, the wind had finally started to die, leaving behind a city sealed under an inch of solid ice, branches down everywhere, the whole neighborhood encased like something preserved in glass. Eleanor had dozed off sitting upright in her kitchen's chair when the soft electronic chime of the satellite phone woke her with a jolt. He was awake, propped against her kitchen cabinets, blankets pooled around his waist, bandages stark white against his chest, the phone already in his hand. His eyes, when they found her, were entirely clear now, moving over the kitchen, the bloody gauze, the IV bag she'd debated hanging, the gun on the counter, with the unhurried precision of a man doing inventory. "You didn't call anyone," he said. It wasn't a question. "You told me not to, and you always do what armed strangers tell you." "Generally, I try not to argue with them, no." She stood, smoothing down scrubs that were stiff with someone else's blood. "You need an actual hospital. Whatever you are, you lost a lot of blood, and I am not equipped to manage internal bleeding on a kitchen floor. I don't need a hospital." He was watching her with an attention that felt almost clinical, the way she imagined he'd looked at everything, assessing, cataloguing, deciding what use it might be to him. You have steady hands, Eleanor. He read it off the badge still clipped to her scrub top, and something about hearing her own name in that low, accented voice made her skin prickle. You saved my life. You didn't have to. I'm aware. I'd like you to leave before I have time to regret it. The ghost of something that might have been amusement crossed his face before pain wiped it away. He looked down at the satellite phone, typed a short string of numbers and coordinates with the speed of long habit, and hit send before she could ask what he was doing. What was that? My location, he said simply. There was an attempt on my life last night. The men responsible failed, but they'll keep looking, and now they'll find this address. The floor seemed to tilt under her. You just told dangerous people where I live. I've told my people where I am, he corrected, unbothered, which means, unfortunately, that I have also told them where you live. You should have left me in the snow, Eleanor. Believe me, I'm aware of that too. That was when she felt it. Not heard it yet, but felt it, a low vibration moving up through the floorboards and into the soles of her feet. Then the sound arrived, a deep mechanical rumble that didn't belong to any storm, growing steadily louder. The unmistakable crunch of heavy tires grinding through ice-crusted snow. Headlights swept across her kitchen ceiling in long, pale streaks. Don't go near the window, he said, voice suddenly sharp with command, all trace of pain submerged beneath it. Don't open that door until I say. The engines idled outside, a dozen of them at least, a sound like the whole street had been swallowed by something enormous. Doors slammed in unison. Boots hit her front porch in a rhythm too organized to be anything but trained. Eleanor stood frozen in her own kitchen, staring at her front door, the quiet, exhausting, ordinary life she'd had 12 hours earlier gone as completely as if the storm had carried it away. A precise 3-beat knock sounded through the house, and the tension dropped visibly from his shoulders. Open it. A man stepped through her door who did not look like he belonged on a residential street in the Beaches. Tailored charcoal coat. An earpiece curled discreetly behind one ear, the stillness of someone who had spent a career being prepared for violence. Behind him, through the open door, Eleanor caught a glimpse of a street transformed. A line of black SUVs stretching down the block further than she could count in the grey morning light, men in tactical gear fanning out along her neighbours' lawns, rifles held low and ready. Boss. The man's eyes flicked once to Eleanor, cataloguing her the same way his employer had, then dismissed her as not currently a problem. He crossed straight to where Daniel, or whatever his real name was, sat against the cabinets. We have a secure route to Pearson. The jet standing by. Casualties. We lost 2 at the Cherry Street warehouse. It was coordinated, sir. Someone fed them our routes. A beat. We think it was Marcus. The name dropped into the kitchen like a stone, and something in the man on her floor went very still, very cold. My brother, he said almost to himself, and the venom in those 2 words made Eleanor's stomach drop. She backed up until she hit the counter, listening to fragments of a conversation she had absolutely no business hearing, conducted in clipped, professional tones across her own blood-stained kitchen floor. This was the moment to leave, to run, to call someone. Except there was nowhere to run to anymore, not with a small army standing on her lawn. I need to go, she said finally, voice cracking despite herself. You have your people, you have your jet. Please, just go. He looked at her then, supported halfway to his feet by the man called Harrow, and something calculating moved behind those pale green eyes. Something that made her wish immediately and completely that she hadn't spoken at all. You're not staying here, Eleanor. Excuse me, this is my house. And in approximately 90 minutes, my brother's men will have cross-referenced the blood trail, the traffic cameras, and the property records, and they will put a bullet in your head for what you know. His voice was flat, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. You have 3 minutes to pack. I'll go to the police, protective custody. The deputy chief in this division has been on Marcus's payroll for 6 years, he said, and watched the last of her composure shatter along with that sentence. There is no clean version of this for you anymore, only a version where you're alive. Harrow's face confirmed every word with its careful blankness. Eleanor looked between them. The bleeding stranger who had upended her entire life in the space of one night, and the armed man waiting patiently to see what she'd decide, and understood, with a kind of sick clarity, that there had never really been a choice at all, not since the moment she'd knelt down in the ice and felt a pulse under her fingers. She ran up the narrow Victorian staircase 2 steps at a time, grabbing a duffel bag and stuffing it with whatever her hands found first. Sweaters, jeans, the worn cardigan her mother had knit her in undergrad, her passport from the lockbox under her bed, moving through the motions on something that wasn't quite panic and wasn't quite calm. By the time she got back downstairs, 2 more men in tactical gear were already moving through her kitchen with quiet efficiency, bagging the bloody gauze, wiping down surfaces, erasing every trace that any of this had happened here. The cold outside hit her like a wall. The full scope of what was parked on her street stole the breath right out of her lungs. Easily 40 vehicles, blacked out and identical, snaking down the block in a line that disappeared around the corner toward Queen Street. Men in tactical gear holding the perimeter in the freezing dawn. An armored SUV pulled directly up to her icy front walk, rear door already open. Harrow guided his employer in first, then turned back for her. "Get in, Doctor." Whitcomb. She climbed into leather upholstery, so soft it felt obscene against everything that had just happened, clutching her duffel bag to her chest like it was the only solid thing left in the world. The door sealed shut with a heavy, sound-proofed thunk, and through tinted glass she watched her narrow Victorian semi, her whole tired, overworked, perfectly ordinary life, disappear into the grey morning as the convoy pulled away in eerie, synchronized silence. She had pulled a freezing stranger off her own steps. Now she was a passenger in someone else's war. The private jet was a different kind of silence entirely. Cream leather, warm lighting, the kind of quiet that came from very expensive engineering rather than an absence of danger. Eleanor sat curled on a sofa in the aft cabin, watching a doctor who introduced himself only as Dr. Okafor finish, securing a fresh IV line into the arm of the man she still didn't have a real name for. They'd gone straight from the convoy onto the tarmac at Pearson, bypassing every checkpoint she'd ever stood in line at, like the rules that governed everyone else's life simply didn't apply here. "Give us the cabin," he said, and the doctor withdrew without a word, sliding the partition shut behind him. "Where are we going?" Eleanor asked, proud of how steady her own voice sounded. "A property in the Laurentians. Off-grid. My brother doesn't know it exists." His eyes studied her with an attention that felt entirely too thorough. "You'll be safe there." "Am I a hostage?" "You're a guest," he said, and something in the way he said it made it sound like a vow rather than a comfort. "A guest to whom I owe a debt that doesn't expire. You saved my life when every reasonable instinct told you not to. Where I come from, that means something absolute. You are under my protection now, Eleanor, whether either of us likes it. I had a life yesterday," she said, anger finally breaking through the numbness. "A residency. An apartment. A normal, exhausting, completely unremarkable life. A life that is currently being dismantled by mercenaries my brother hired through 3 different shell companies," he said evenly, and reached for a tablet on the table beside the medical bed, tapping the screen before sliding it across to her. "Look." She didn't want to look. She looked anyway. A live security feed, grainy but unmistakable, showed 3 unmarked vans parked across her narrow front lawn, men with battering rams already through her front door, swarming through the house she'd lived in for 2 years like it belonged to no one. If she'd stayed and argued her way into staying, she understood with a cold drop in her stomach she would already be dead. "They're not police," he said quietly, watching her face. "Private contractors. My brother pays well, and your local force has been told to stay clear." "Why?" she whispered, staring at the wall of polished mahogany rather than at him, because she couldn't quite look at him and ask it at the same time. "Why would your own brother do this to you?" "Because our father built this network on shipping and discipline, and Marcus wants to pivot it into trafficking. People, fentanyl precursors, whatever moves the most money fastest." I refused. So he bought my lieutenants, hired an army, and tried to bury me in an ice storm. He leaned forward slightly, jaw tight against pain he wasn't bothering to hide anymore. He failed, and now I intend to take apart everything he's built, piece by piece, until there's nothing left for him to inherit. The flat certainty in his voice put a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the plane's air conditioning. And I'm just supposed to wait in a fortress in the mountains while you do that? You're going to wait there because right now it's the only place on this continent where you're safe. He paused, something flickering behind his eyes that looked almost like reluctance. And because you matter more than you understand yet, what is that supposed to mean? He reached into the pocket of the fresh trousers someone had laid out for him and produced the same handgun she'd moved off her counter the night before, popping the magazine free with a practiced flick of his thumb. With his thumbnail he pried a small false panel loose from the base of it, and a tiny black micro SD card dropped into his palm. My brother believes he burned the shipping ledgers at the Cherry Street warehouse before it went up, he said, holding the chip up to the cabin light. The ones that tie him to 2 city councillors and a cartel contact in Hamilton. He doesn't know I pulled the files before the fire. He doesn't know they're sitting in this card. His eyes found hers, and the smallest, most dangerous smile she'd ever seen crossed his face. When you dragged me off your steps, Eleanor, you didn't only save my life, you saved the one thing that can end my brother's entire operation. She stared at the chip in his palm, the full vertiginous weight of what she'd stumbled into finally landing all at once. She wasn't a bystander caught in someone else's crossfire anymore. She was holding, quite literally, now, since he'd just closed her fingers around it, the one piece of leverage that might decide who survived this war and who didn't. The plane began its descent toward a horizon of white-capped mountains, and somewhere in that long, silent fall, Eleanor understood that the doctor who'd driven home through an ice storm 12 hours earlier didn't exist anymore. The woman closing her hand around a stranger's secret 30,000 feet over the Laurentians was someone else entirely, and there was no version of tomorrow that led back to the life she'd left bleeding out on her own kitchen floor.